Those who aren't able to join us can do that, can check it out later. So for those who don't know me, I should have renamed myself. I'll do that afterwards, but I'm Rabbi Rubenstein, Rabbi Stephen Rubenstein from Congregation Beth Ahm here in West Bloomfield. I know, obviously, I know a lot of the faces on the screen, many Beth Ahm members, and some other people from the community. And then there are people from our community and perhaps beyond who I don't know. And I'm really glad that you're here for this series. You know, sometimes when we invite speakers in from out of town or even speakers from in town who people may not know, I do my best to really sort of communicate with a little bit of PR why I really think people should show up. And I'm hoping I did a good enough job, because even though I was never a classroom student of Rabbi Dorff, I consider him my teacher, and really one of the very, very important teachers in the conservative movement and in the American Jewish world today. And I think you'll know why, even tonight, and certainly over the course of these 3 weeks. I've had the opportunity to learn with Rabbi Dorff more actually since rabbinical school than during rabbinical school. I went to school at JTS in New York, and he was mostly stationed over those years in LA at the American Jewish University. Before I give a proper introduction to Rabbi Dorff and our evening, I want to thank the Maimonides Society of Jewish Federation for partnering with us. And I know that some of the people who registered for this session or for this course came to us through that society, and we really appreciate them doing that and spreading the word, and we're really glad that you're with us. Let me introduce Rabbi Dorff properly. I hope it's okay. He didn't ask me to read his whole bio, and I'm not going to, but I'm going to tell you I'll tell you a few things. Rabbi Dorff, Rabbi Elliot Dorff, is the rector of American Jewish University and the Solon Ann Dorff Distinguished Service Professor in Philosophy. For more than 40 years, he's been a visiting professor on Jewish law at UCLA School of Law. He was awarded the Journal of Law and Religion's Lifetime Achievement Award and holds 4 honorary doctoral degrees. There are many things to say about his scholarship, but I thought that for this evening, it might be best to give you just a couple of inklings of his involvement with Jewish medical ethics and medical ethics in general. In spring of 1993, Rabbi Dorff served on the ethics committee of Hillary Rodham Clinton's healthcare task force. In March of 1997 and May of 99, he testified on behalf of the Jewish tradition on the subject of human cloning and stem cell research before the President's National Bioethics Advisory Commission. And while there are many more such service that he has provided throughout our community, I just also wanted to point out that he is a past president of Jewish Family Services in LA, and also a member of the ethics committee at the UCLA Medical Center. For me, I would also just add that he's also the co-chair of the Committee of Jewish Law and Standards for the Rabbinical Assembly, what we often call the Law Committee, plays a very important role in the life of the conservative movement and in our synagogue in particular. And I'll just say the last thing, which is I told people you should really come, because he's a wonderful, wonderful teacher. And I'm really glad to welcome him. And thank you so much for being here, Rabbi Dorff.
My pleasure. Thank you. And, you know, I wish my mother had heard that. That kind of thing, right? I'm going to 2 introductory comments before we get to the meat of today's session. The first is why Jewish medical ethics altogether. What's wrong with regular medical ethics? And the answer is that there's nothing wrong with regular medical ethics. It's just that it comes from a particular perspective. And in the United States, that perspective is Western liberalism. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, they're endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Jefferson, in the Declaration of Independence, cribbed that from John Locke, who had written that about a century earlier. But Locke said life, liberty, and property. And you can imagine how many doctoral dissertations have been written about why Jefferson changed it to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But in the American environment, in this Western liberal environment, I am an individual with rights. Now, from the Jewish perspective, the central story is Exodus, leaving Egypt, Sinai, and then the trek to the Promised Land. We leave Egypt not as individuals, we leave as a community. And when we get to Sinai, we don't get a single right. We get 613 commandments. I do a lot of interfaith work, and as I say to Catholic audiences, this is the beginning of Jewish guilt. And they tell me, you know nothing about guilt. We Catholics have it cornered. So I'll leave it at that, right? But the point is that from a Jewish perspective, I'm first and foremost a member of a community, and as such, I have duties. Now, sometimes duties and rights are reciprocal. So if I have a right to my sweater, let's say, you have a duty not to steal it, right? So sometimes rights and duties are reciprocal in that way, but they're not always that way. And in any case, if I get up in the morning and I'm an individual with rights, then the world owes me. But if I get up in the morning and I'm a member of a community with duties, then I owe the world. It's a whole different way of looking at life. And we American Jews embody both of those perspectives, and we do our best to balance them throughout our lifetime. And there's some really wonderful things about the American understanding of things. And there are some really wonderful things about the Jewish understanding of things. And every once in a while, on particular issues, they actually coalesce. They say the same thing. But we start from very different perspectives in the American side of us and in the Jewish side of us. So you might be interested in Jewish medical ethics in part because it's your own as a Jew. And you might be interested in it also because on some issues, in any case, it gives you a very different perspective on life in general and on medical ethics in particular. And we're going to see some of those examples tonight and next week and the week after as well. So that's the first introductory comment, why Jewish medical ethics altogether. The second introductory comment is that medicine has really exploded over the last 100 years in its ability to prevent disease and cure it. Just to give you a sense of that, life expectancy in these United States around the 1900 was about 45, and 100 years later, it was around 76. That's just within 100 years. Most of that is not about what you read about it's not because of what you read about in newspapers. Most of that is public health measures. Things like you're taught to wash your hands before you eat your meal and after you go to the bathroom. Things like vaccinations. Things like public education in other ways. Things like the problems with smoking, the problems with obesity, the problems with drug overuse, right? And this is part and parcel of the education that people get in America, and that's a large part of why we live longer. In certain places, I don't know what the law is in Michigan, but California was actually the first state to ban smoking in restaurants and then later in bars. And now you're not even allowed to smoke on Venice Beach. So, I mean, you're not allowed to smoke within 50 feet of the entrance to a public building. Now, and then we passed Proposition 67 a number of years ago, which raised the taxes on cigarettes to be used for ads, again, directed at teenagers against smoking. And so as a result, all of that has an impact. I mean, if you look at the latest CDC statistics, the average smoking rate in America is 21%. The state with the highest smoking rate, what would you guess? Anybody want to try? State with the highest smoking rate? Just
Kentucky. Kentucky.
Yes, Kentucky, you got it. That's right. I thought it was North Carolina, but it is actually Kentucky. 28% there. The state with the lowest smoking rate, anyone want to guess that?
Vermont.
No.
Utah?
You got it. As soon as you said it, everybody else understands why, right? It's because of the Mormons, right? That's a lot of social pressure against smoking, where it's about 8%. California is the second lowest, and we have a much larger population and a much more diverse population, where the smoking rate is about 14%. It's about a third less than the national average. And part of the reason for that are all these public health things, both laws and education, that enable us to avoid a lot of dangers to our, to our health. Second most important piece of that, in terms of living longer is antibiotics. I'm an example of that. I inherited from my father's side of the family a weakness in my bronchial tubes. So my father had a brother who had bronchitis. This was the 1920s. It became pneumonia and he died. I've had bronchitis maybe 15 times in my life and I'm still around, right? So that's really the wonder drugs of antibiotics. We are overusing them both in animals and in humans. And as a result, they are not nearly as effective as they used to be against certain diseases. But they still are the reasons why a lot of us are around when we would not have been without them. And then it's only from a strictly a statistical point of view, it's only in a tertiary way that the kinds of things that you read about in newspapers are enabling us to live longer. Things like heart transplants and kidney transplants and the like, right? That kind of thing is really important, but from a statistical point of view, it's much less important than these other two things, enabling us to live much longer. Now that's, we would all say that that's a blessing. However, what that does is that it immediately puts us into the middle of the Kantian problem. Immanuel Kant pointed out, he died in 1798. So he pointed out that when you cannot do something, then you never have to ask whether you should, because you cannot. But as soon as you can do something, then you do have to ask whether you should, because there are all kinds of things that you can do that you should not do. You can smoke, but you should not. You can abuse drugs or alcohol, but you should not. Now, here comes my Achilles heel. You can eat a half a gallon of ice cream every night of the week. And if you're doing it, it might as well be mint chocolate chip or cherry Garcia. That stuff is so good. Which I can tell you now at 4:42 in Los Angeles. At midnight, it's a whole different story. But you can do that, but you should not do that because you will gain 500 pounds in no time. And that will be bad for all kinds of reasons, right? So the fact that we can sustain people's lives far beyond what they would have lived, the lives that they would have lived simply by nature, is in many ways a real blessing, but sometimes not so. And one of the things that we're going to be dealing with a third time that we meet together on end-of-life issues is, when is it not that way, right? When should life support be withdrawn, and under what circumstances, and for what reasons, and all of that. So and similarly, by the way, at the beginning of life, thankfully we now have infertility techniques that have helped a lot of couples, and for that matter, single people, have children that they would not have been able to have without a lot of these techniques. But then the question becomes, when does the right to do that, or when does the possibility to do that become the obligation to do that, right? Is there going to be a lot of pressure on couples who are not able to have children on their own, just the natural way, a lot of pressure on them to use, in vitro fertilization, whatever, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, all kinds of things, in order to be able to have children? And if so, designer children and all kinds of things like that, all kinds of issues that arise that would never have even crossed the mind of our grandparents, maybe even our parents, because those procedures simply were not available. So and if that's the true in general, all the more so if you're trying to take an ancient tradition like Judaism and apply it to the modern world. And what I would suggest to you is that there are a variety of different methodological approaches to this. I'm just going to mention three, two on the ends and one in the middle, and you'll see why in just a moment. One approach is, quoting Ben Bagbag in Pirkei Avot and Ethics of the Fathers, "Hafochba v'hafochba dekuleba." Turn it over and turn it over again, because everything is in it. So, by hook or by crook, I'm going to find a reason, something in the Jewish tradition that will tell me whether I should use the new infertility techniques or not, or whether I should remove life support or not, or whether I should do organ transplantation, or whether I should vaccinate, and things like that. Somehow or another, I'm going to find that in the Jewish tradition. Now, the advantage of that is that if you do find it in the Jewish tradition, whatever you find, then that immediately makes the Jewish tradition relevant to modern circumstances. And by the way, it's not just in medicine, using the Jewish tradition to understand business on the internet. What is moral business on the internet? What is moral communication on Facebook and Twitter and all of that, right? Now, some of the Jewish tradition can be really relevant to all of those questions, but if you are going to say that the tradition tells me very specific instructions about whether to remove life support or not, I'll just take that example, right? Then on the one hand, you're making the tradition relevant. The problem with it is that you're doing eisegesis rather than exegesis. That is, you're reading into the tradition what you want to read into the tradition rather than extracting from it what it actually says. You're being dishonest in that way, right? Because the tradition, just take my word for it, did not know about heart lung machines until they were invented. The tradition did not know about preimplantation genetic diagnosis until it was invented some 20 years ago, right? So given the fact that tradition didn't know about a lot of the things that in modern life, then to say that you're going to get specific instructions about a lot of these questions in modern life from the tradition is really abusing the tradition. It's really being disingenuous. So the other side of the tradition is, if the other end of the methodological spectrum is that, well, if it doesn't say anything about X, then I can't get any guidance from the tradition at all about X. I've got to go elsewhere for it. Now, on the one hand, that's honest, right? That's saying that if the tradition says nothing about heart lung machines or the ethics of business on the internet, then to claim that it does say something would be dishonest. The problem with it, of course, is that means that the tradition becomes irrelevant to all kinds of things in life, right? And not only things having to do with modern technology. There have been parents and children ever since the beginning of humanity, right? But until very recently in human history, women were at home and therefore could take care of elderly parents, right? And therefore, if you look at the tradition, honor your father and mother, the way that the tradition understands it is that, first of all, well, when I was growing up, I thought it meant that I had to obey my parents. And my parents did not disabuse me of that interpretation. It wasn't until I got to rabbinical school when I found out that the way that the rabbis understood honor your father and mother had nothing to do with children. It had to do with middle-aged children of elderly adults. And basically what it says is you have to feed them when they cannot feed themselves. You have to lead them in and out when they cannot walk by themselves, right? And that, until very recently, and the tradition says this, the best way to do that is if you're doing it personally at home, right? But now nobody's home during the day in many families. And now many families are spread out all over the place, right? So what does it mean to honor your father and mother in modern circumstances? Is arranging for them to be in an assisted living facility, does that fulfill the obligation, right? What about a skilled nursing facility when that's required, right? And what are your obligations even if you put your parents in one of those kinds of things, right? So my point here is that if you're going to say that the tradition is only relevant to those things that it specifically talks about, then a large part of life, and not just just the new parts made new by technology, but the new parts made new by economic conditions, social conditions, all kinds of things, right? Communication, like Zoom, all of this kind of thing becomes, the tradition becomes irrelevant to all of it. So what I would suggest to you is a middle ground. I am not a conservative rabbi by accident. Okay, the middle ground is the following. When the tradition says something specific about a given issue in medical ethics or anything else about life, then you at least have to evaluate. You have to ask whether what it says about, let's say, the status of a fetus in Exodus chapter 21, what it says about the status of a fetus is what we continue to want to say about the status of a fetus, vis-a-vis all kinds of interventions, including abortion, including birth control, and including in vitro fertilization, all of that, right? Do we want to take what the Torah itself says, and then later what the rabbis deduce from it, and simply run with it, right? That's a judgment call. But at least in regard to the status of a fetus, you have something that's very specific in the Torah itself about the status of a fetus. And the rabbis are even more specific. So there, at least, you have to, if you're going to be traditional at all, you have to give the tradition at least a hearing, right? And if it's really, and if it tells you some things about how you need to conduct business, then you have to at least understand how those kinds of instructions might apply to modern business conditions, okay? But where it doesn't say anything specific, then what you need to do is what I sometimes call depth theology. That is, you have to identify the underlying principles and views of the Jewish tradition and try to apply them to modern circumstances. So what I'm going to do with you tonight is talk about three of the underlying principles of the Jewish tradition that apply to modern medical ethics, and we'll talk about how we'll apply them, and just so that you understand that this is not obvious. Along the way, I'm going to make some distinctions between how the Jewish tradition would see this and how the American legal tradition sees this, and then also how Christianity would see this. Okay, and so we'll do this with three of them. I'm going to be completely self-serving here. I wrote a book on medical ethics called Matters of Life and Death, a Jewish approach to modern medical ethics. And in a chapter there, I think I talk about 7 different underlying principles, but tonight it'll be good enough to just deal with 3 of them. So I'm going to share my screen. It's the materials that were sent out to you. So if you have them handy and you have them on, in the hard copy, that's fine. But in case you don't, we're going to start this way. So the first thing is God's ownership of our bodies. Mark the heavens to their uttermost reaches belong to the Lord your God, the earth and all that is on it. Deuteronomy. Right? We also have, I didn't quote it here, Psalm 24, verse 1, L'Adonai haaretz umlo'ah tevel v'yoshveva. To God is the world and its fullness, the firmament, the world and all who dwell on it, who live on it, right? So God owns our bodies. Now that already is a problem from the American point of view. In American law, who owns your body? Anyone?
Each person owns their own.
Correct. This, if it was not at all clear from life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right, the liberty piece of that, or the 14th Amendment that makes the liberty thing really very articulate, it became very clear in the Nancy Cruzan decision of the U.S. Supreme Court in 1990, which stated that every adult, not true for children, but every adult has the right to refuse any medical intervention. And that includes artificial nutrition and hydration, right? It doesn't give you the right to insist on any, you don't have a right to say that I have a right to a heart transplant. You don't have that right in American law, but you do have a right to refuse a heart transplant or to refuse kidney dialysis or whatever, right? You have, because you own your own body. So therefore, whereas in the Jewish tradition, God owns your body. Therefore, for your own, the second source here, for your own lifeblood, I will require a reckoning. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For in his image did God make man. In other words, we don't have the right to murder, and we also don't have the right to commit suicide.
Rabbi Dorff,
Right? Yeah, sure.
maybe make the text a little bit bigger if you could on your side.
Oh, sure. Let me see if I can do that. There's got to be, yeah, here we go. Can I do that? Just a moment. Let's do this first. There we go. Okay. Is that better? Good.
That's better. Thank you.
No, thank you.
You also can get rid of all that stuff at the top and be in a bigger screen. There's a little indicator there on the right-hand side, and that will clear all the rest of the stuff and that will be your whole.
More thing?
Yeah, no, thanks very much. I think this will be sufficient, though. I appreciate that. We don't want to
Okay.
mess up the source sheet.
That's all right. And what does it mean then? It means also that not only do I have the duty not to kill anyone else or myself, but I have to take care of myself, right? Take a look at source number 3 here. When Hillel had finished the lesson with his students, he accompanied them part of the way. They said to him, "Master, where are you going?" To perform a religious duty. What religious duty? To bathe in the bathhouse. Now remember, this is all before indoor plumbing, right? So you have to literally go to a bathhouse in order to do this. Is that a religious duty? Answer them, if somebody appointed to scrape and clean the statues of the king, which are set up in the theaters and the circuses, is paid to do the work, and furthermore associates with nobility, how much more should I, who am created in the divine image and likeness, take care of my body? So I have a duty to take care of my body. Now, why do I have a duty to take care of my body? From an American point of view, before you read number 4, from an American point of view, why should I take care of my body? Why should I avoid smoking and alcohol abuse and drug abuse and ice cream to a fault? Why should I and positively do exercise? Why should I get enough sleep?
It's yours and you should look after it.
Yes, why should I look after it?
Because if you get sick, there's a possibility of you becoming a burden on society.
Good. So if I get sick, first of all, I'm not going to feel very good. So I might do it for a very self-serving reason. I don't want to get sick, right? But I also might do it because I have more of a community in mind, namely that I'm going to be a burden on my family. I'm going to be a burden on my community. Why else? Can anybody think of another reason why I should take care of myself in an American understanding of things?
If you don't, you're desecrating what God wishes for us to do.
Oh, but that's religious language,
Okay.
right? I mean, and we'll get to
Well,
that very shortly.
An able-bodied person is productive, and therefore
Yes.
there's a financial gain to the government. There's a tax. You're getting taxes.
Absolutely. That's American pragmatism with a capital P.
Yep.
Right, exactly right. Okay. Because if you are not healthy, then you won't be able to do work and you won't be able to earn a living and pay taxes and all of that. Right. So part of the reason why you have to keep a healthy body is so that you can contribute to society and not be a burden on society. And by the way, I mean, there are corporations now, because of reasons of having to do with the amount of money they have to pay for your healthcare insurance, that will say that we will only pay for your healthcare insurance if you don't smoke, if you don't abuse drugs and alcohol, and if you use the gym that we provide for you at least 3 times a week.
Whoa.
There are actually corporations that are doing that these days, right? So the reason why I should, from the American point of view, the reason why I should take care of my body is completely pragmatic. I'll feel better. I'll be able to do more. I won't be a burden on society or my employer. All of those good pragmatic reasons. Now take a look at Maimonides, who himself, of course, was a physician. He's writing in the 12th century. He who regulates his life in accordance with the laws of hygiene, with the sole motive of maintaining a sound and vigorous physique and begetting children to do his work and labor for his benefit, good luck, is not following the right course. A man should aim to maintain a physical health and vigor in order that his soul may be upright in a condition to know God. Whoever throughout his life follows this course will be continually serving God. Oh, I want to make sure I can do this. Yes, that's right. Serving God even while engaged in business and even during cohabitation, that is sexual relations, because his purpose and all that he does will be to satisfy his needs so as to have a sound body with which to serve God. Now that's a whole different understanding of why I should take care of my body, right? It's because I have a duty to serve God, and I can only do that if I take care of my body. Now, of course, all of us can get sick for reasons that have nothing to do with what we have done. I mean, there are people who have been doubly vaccinated and gotten the booster and nevertheless, find themselves positive for COVID, right? But even then, that's, if they've gotten all of those vaccines, they are much less likely to die as a result of it and are much less likely to have serious consequences and be a burden on society in hospitals that are way oversubscribed these days, right? So it's the rationale is this. So I'm going to get back to my ice cream example. If I were only an American and I knew full well that eating a half a gallon of ice cream every night of the week was going to make me fat and unproductive, I wouldn't be very good at my job. And by the way, we have all kinds of evidence that people who are overweight are much less likely to be able to get jobs, are much less likely to be able to get life insurance and health insurance and all of that, and even have a harder time making friends, right? So for all of those pragmatic reasons, I might avoid overeating ice cream. But if I knew all of that and said, even so, ice cream is just too important for me, and I really don't care about all those other things. If I don't have a lot of friends, I don't have a good job, and all of that, it's just not worth the ice cream. Okay? Then there's no law in America, as far as I know, that would prohibit me from eating ice cream, a half a gallon of ice cream every night of the week. Right? On the other hand, as a Jew, I don't have that right, because I have a duty to God. I have a fiduciary, those of you who are lawyers, I have a fiduciary duty to God. That is a matter of trust on God's part. My body belongs to God, and I have a duty to God to take care of it. Right? So I don't have a right to eat a half a gallon of ice cream every night of the week. Right? So there you have an example of where the American side of us and the Jewish side of us would actually go in very different directions. Starting out with who owns your body, do you or does God? Now, the next thing, and again here I want to give you a sort of introductory thing. In Western philosophy, starting with Plato, there's a sharp dichotomy between the body and the mind. The body is the animal in you, and the mind is the distinctly human in you. And as a result of that, starting really again with Plato and through into the Middle Ages and the modern period, one of the real sort of stock issues in Western philosophy is what's called the mind-body problem. Namely, if the mind and the body are so distinct, how are they connected? Descartes, one of the inventors of calculus in the 17th century, thought that the pineal gland, it's the gland in your head, was the magic place where the mind and the body were connected. And still to this day, in modern medical research, I have a friend actually at the University of Pennsylvania who does this. They are doing MRI tests, right? You have you're in an MRI machine, and they are asking you questions, and they're measuring in nanoseconds how long it takes you to answer the question, and because what they're looking for is, where does free will come from? Can you measure free will in nanoseconds in an MRI machine, right? But that all starts with the presumption that the mind and the body are really completely separate things. And it was that kind of way of looking at things that really sort of ruled medicine in the middle of the 20th century, where the idea was that doctors were primarily interested in fixing the body, and it's and that's what their training was in. It's only really in the late 20th century that some medical schools anyway began to change that. I was on a committee for a curriculum committee for UCLA Medical School in the early 1990s, and interestingly, the people on the medical staff there who were involved in this were 2 senior physicians and 2 junior physicians, all 4 of them Jewish. And you'll see why that's important in just a moment. And basically what the idea was to try to help physicians in training understand the non-physical parts of being a doctor. So things like the anthropology of medicine, the sociology of medicine, religious issues, ethical things, the economics of medicine. So we created a series of cases which would illustrate those things. So I remember the first case that we had, and by the way, now ever since at UCLA Medical School, This program is called doctoring, and medical students at UCLA, all 4 years of medical school have to take it. And it's a series of cases that they deal with that illustrate these various things. And it's Los Angeles after all. So in the first 2 years of medical school, these cases are actually acted out by professional actors. And then in the last 2 years, they see some of these cases on the floors of the hospital. So I remember the first case that we created was a 15-year-old woman who comes into your office complaining of stomach problems. You examine her and her stomach is fine. She's just pregnant. Now, it would be better if she were 18, and just because her body would be more mature and able to handle the pregnancy better. But at 15, if she doesn't have other problems and if she gets a lot of good prenatal care, she'll probably be okay. But, or I should say, she is Catholic, and she is Hispanic, and she is unmarried. So first of all, the fact that she's Catholic means that probably an abortion is off the table. Although I'm co-chair of the priest-rabbi dialogue in Los Angeles, I've been part of that ever since 1973, and I know a lot of priests as a result. And the priests very often talk about the American church as the Pope's loyal opposition. So exactly, and that's certainly true for Catholics vis-a-vis birth control, much less so for abortion. So probably no abortion here, right? She's Hispanic. So if she were Irish Catholic, not so much now, but 30 years ago, even still, she probably would be kicked out of the house and would have to carry this child in a home for unwed mothers. But in the Hispanic community, that's not true. So she will probably still be able to stay at home while she's gestating this baby, right? What will happen when she gives birth? Will she give it up for adoption? Will she keep it? If she keeps it, who's going to take care of it? Will she ever be able to finish high school? And where's the guy in all of this, right? All of these kinds of questions the doctors need to at least be aware of and make sure that somebody is dealing with these things, because this woman's medical care will very much depend upon the answers to a lot of these questions. And how much money do they have in order to be able to provide this prenatal care? What kind of insurance does she have, right? So all of this really sort of indicates that we are not really the rugged individualists that Theodore Roosevelt talked about, right? As soon as we're born into a family and a community. The Jewish tradition was well aware of this from a long time ago. So I'll give you a moment to read source B1. Okay, so if you will, read source B1.
Might be good again to expand the text.
Oh yes,
a bit.
I'm sorry. Let me make it bigger.
It looked like some people might bang their heads on their computer screen as they leaned in. So.
You're right. You're absolutely right. Sorry. There we go. So also the Holy Blessed One brings the soul and throws it. That's literally the Talmud's word, ramini, throws it into the body and judges them as one. Now, it's a simple story, but it flies in the face of all Western philosophy, because basically what it's saying is that the body and the mind are coordinated within us, right? And that we, and actually I could have given you another source from Pirkei Avot, Tova Torah im Yafet Torah im derech eretz, right? The study of Torah is good with a worldly occupation, because if you do only one or the other, that will lead you to sin, Pirkei Avot says. This is chapter 2, Mishnah 2, if I remember correctly, right? If you do only study, and of course the rabbis really valued study, if you do only study, that's going to lead you to sin. And if you do only a worldly occupation, that's going to lead you to sin. So what you need is the integration of the body and the mind. Okay? Take a look at number 3 here. I don't know why it's number 3. That's my mistake. Should be number 2. Sorry. So what this is saying effectively is that the kind of asceticism that still to this day is very much honored in Catholicism and in Buddhism, by the way, is not our way of doing things, right? The Nazarite, the one who refrains from wine and other intoxicants completely, right, is sinning against God, because God provided these forms of pleasure for us to take advantage of in moderation, of course, right? But still, right, and that's why the Nazarite has to bring a sin offering at the end of his period of Nazirut, right? So we are supposed to take advantage of what God has provided for us within moderation, because that's part and parcel of I mean, they didn't know about endorphins, and they didn't know about, things like serotonin levels and stuff like that, right? But they knew that, the psalmist already says it, Yain yisamach lulav enosh. In Psalm 104, the wine brings the joy to the heart of a person, right? Now, you may not like wine. I'd much rather spend my calories on ice cream than wine. But for people who like wine, this is something, again, in moderation, that one should take advantage of, okay? And then the other issue is that we are not just integrated within ourselves, we are also integrated within a community. And if you will read number 4 here from Sota. So we are part of a community. And being part of a community means that we also have the obligation to visit the sick within our community. Now, you and I don't like to go to visit the sick people, especially in hospitals, right? Why don't you like to do that? Just unmute yourself.
It reminds us of our mortality.
Yes, it reminds us of our mortality. And you don't want to be reminded of that. Good. What's another reason? Why you don't like it?
We don't know what to say.
Yes, and I'm going to come back to that. Thank you, Nancy. Absolutely right. We don't know what to say. Good. And what's another reason why you don't like to go visit people in hospitals?
You might
It's
get something.
depressing.
Yeah, you might get sick. The hospital is not the good place if you want to avoid illness. Right, exactly right. Good. So those are all very good reasons that you don't want to visit people in the hospital. And then, of course, there's the schlep of it all, right? You're not going to see people in the usual places you see them. You're going to have to put this in your calendar. You're going to have to pay for parking, and then you're going to have to figure out where that person is. And I don't know about Michigan, but I must tell you that both Cedars and UCLA, hospitals that I know, I'm still trying to figure out how their numbering system works. And then you finally get to the person's room, to the patient's room, and what is likely to be the case?
They won't be there.
They won't be there because they're out for tests, or
They're asleep.
they're asleep. Now, neither of those is going to encourage you to come back as a visitor, right? So the tradition never understood that, and that's long before modern hospitals, and therefore made it an obligation. And you can see, I'm just going to bring it down. You can see the way that Maimonides puts this. Visiting the sick is an obligation incumbent on everyone, even the great, that is those of high social status, visit the small, those of low social status. And we should visit many times each day, and all who add visits are to be praised as long as they do not burden the sick person. And anyone who visits the sick is as if he took away a part of that person's illness and made things easier for him. Anyone who fails to visit the sick, as if he sheds blood. I mean, that's pretty extreme, right? Now, why is that the case? I'm going to suggest to you four pieces of illness, 4 aspects of illness that make it a requirement in our tradition to visit the sick. Number 1, illness is isolating, right? And as we have found out more often, even more extensively than we ever knew before the pandemic, and we'll talk much more about this next time, illness is really isolating. And we are, as Aristotle said, social animals. We really do need to be in contact with other people. Yes, of course, everybody needs some time alone, right? But we really also need to be in touch with other people. You don't have to go to Aristotle with that. For that, Genesis chapter 2, it's not good for a person to live alone, okay? Or to be alone anyway, without any ability to be in touch with other people. So, and illness is isolating because when you are ill, you're not going to see people in the usual places you see them. Secondly, illness is debilitating, right? So what I say to doctors, and I talk to a lot of doctors, is that when you walk into the room, now here, pretend that this is the patient, and let's see how we can do this. And here we go. And this is you. Let's do it the other way. If you're standing and the patient is lying down, what does that body language say?
The doctor is in charge.
That's right. I'm in charge. I'm healthy. I'm good. You are not. And that's the last thing you want to say to a patient. So I say to rabbinical students, I say to doctors, and I say to people who are simply going to visit other people, sit down. As a matter of fact, Maimonides was writing at a time when there were no there were no raised beds, right? When people slept on a mat or a mattress on the ground. And what he says is that you actually have to lie down so that your head is not higher than the head of the patient, right? Thankfully now beds are raised, so you can just sit down and talk to the patient that way, right? Third, what do you talk about? And let me just say that illness is infantilizing. That's the third aspect of illness, right? It's isolating, it's debilitating, and it's infantilizing because you can't do the things that you would normally do. And let me just tell you, and I'm sure your rabbi can reinforce this, both patients and their visitors get sick of talking about the weather and the food in about 10 seconds, right? So what do you talk about? And this I learned, I must say. I finished rabbinical school in 1970, and then I spent another year in New York working on my doctoral dissertation at Columbia. And I was asked by two social workers to do a series of 3 sessions on Jewish theology for people in the Jewish Home for the Aged. And they taught me a lot about what happens in old age, namely that some of the same body language that you're used to doesn't apply to elderly people. And in fact, there was a man in this group who had been a dentist, and he had his eyes closed through an entire session. And then he raised his hand, and the question he asked made it clear that he had heard absolutely everything that went on during that session, right? Because having your eyes closed doesn't mean what it means earlier in life, right? So they taught me about a lot of this. And at one point, and what they required me to do was to prepare source sheets like this. And this is all before Zoom and all of that. This is 1970. And but we did have a Xerox machine, so you could blow it up into big print. And to actually give them readings that they had to read in preparation for these sessions. And these people really did the readings, I must say. I can't say that for all of my students. These students really did the readings, right? So I said to these social workers before I started this, why of all things Jewish theology? And one of them said to me, because these people are sick of bingo, right? Many of them have had a college education, and even those who had not wanted to be intellectually stimulated. And so Jewish theology. Now, I'm not saying to you that when you go and visit people, talk about Jewish theology, right? Unless you both happen to be interested in it. But the basic idea is, because illness is infantilizing, try to reverse that. Try to talk to the patient as an adult. So what does that mean? You talk to the patient about the same things that you would normally talk about if the patient were well. So if that's books or movies or show business or politics or whatever it is you normally talk about, right? Talk about the same things with the patient. What is the subtext of that? What are you saying to the patient when you are talking about the exact same things that you would normally talk about if the patient were well? What are you?
You're
Go
saying
ahead.
they're of value.
That's right. You're of value. Exactly. You're not an infant. You are an adult. And your opinion matters. Exactly right. So
I
talk
could
with them.
argue,
Yes, by
Rabbi,
all means argue. Yes, we are Jews
Could-
after all. Okay. Right.
couldn't it also imply that I'm afraid to talk about the elephant in the room with you?
Oh, no, I'm sorry. Thank you. One thing that you should do by all means is enable the person to talk about their illness. How do you do that? You don't say, how do you feel? Because that's the answer to that is either fine or terrible. And that's a conversation stopper, right? So what do you say? You say, what did the doctor say? And then the patient will have the ability to either say, I really don't want to talk about it, in which case, talk about something else. Or the patient will say, well, the doctor said that actually I'm going to recover from this, in which case you rejoice with the patient and you talk about, well, what can I do until you're dismissed from the hospital and for your family, maybe your children, whatever. And how can I help you, once you are dismissed to go back home, right? Some very, again, pragmatic things. And so if that's the prognosis, that's wonderful. If the prognosis is terrible, then what you need to talk about is, well, how can we get whatever meaning we can get out of life for the rest of your life? What kinds of things, and for some people, it's, see relatives that they haven't seen in years. For some people, it's making amends with people that they have offended. For some people, it's making peace with family members. And by the way, I've certainly seen this. I would imagine your rabbi has seen it as well, where a brother and sister, let's say, have not talked to each other in decades, but everybody knows, pardon the expression, what a deadline is, and that there's not going to be any ability to be able to do this once the person has died. And so if you're going to reconcile, now's the time, right? So you enable people to talk about that. What can they do, even if they're going to die of this disease? What can they do in the time remaining to make their lives as meaningful as possible, right? But the fourth aspect of illness is that the vast majority of us are going to die not of an acute illness, a sudden heart attack or a car accident, but rather of an illness that lasts for a long time. Right, some 85% of us are going to die of a disease that will last for a long time. And so that then brings up the fourth aspect of illness. It is boring, right? Especially if you have an illness that's going to last for a long time. What do you do? What do you talk about? What can you do, given the fact that you're not able to do everything you used to be able to do? Well, one of the things that our tradition created in the Middle Ages is what's called an ethical will. And originally it was literally what a parent wrote to his or her children, talking about the values that he or she tried to live by during your life. And we have these kinds of letters from the Middle Ages, and you can read some of them. Actually, there are two books published by Jewish Publication Society on ethical wills. One of them by Josh Stamfer, Alav Shalom. He just died recently, who talked about how you create an ethical will, and then another in which he just simply put together a number of ethical wills that people had written at various times in their lives, not necessarily when they were dying. But now it doesn't have to be a letter. It can be a recording of various sorts. So I'm sorry that I didn't think to do this with my parents, but with my in-laws, I videotaped them. And basically what I videotaped them doing was, I didn't know the family stories. So what are your earliest memories, right? Who was there? What were they like? How do they get along? What do they care about, right? Who are some of your teachers? What were they like? Who are some of your family members? Where did you live? Right? All of those kinds of questions. And I did this with my father-in-law, and then I did it with my mother-in-law. And then my wife saw these videotapes, and I remember her saying, he didn't tell the story that way the last time I heard it from him, and that's okay, right? Because these recordings are not for public consumption. These recordings are for the family. And even if the children are not really interested in hearing the stories anymore, the grandchildren really are. So if you are visiting somebody with a long-term illness, one of the things you can do is bring a recording machine and do what I just said. Say, we're going to create a recording for your family and friends about your life. And that, by the way, is a reason to get up in the morning, right? If you know that somebody's going to come and record your life history for the purposes of your children and your grandchildren and your friends to listen to it, that's a reason to get up in the morning, right? And that's what makes it less than the boring kind of life it might be if you have a long-term illness. Okay. Now, the last thing I want to talk about, and we're getting near the end of time, but I want to leave some time for questions, is the permission and obligation to heal. That's the third thing, the third piece of it. So the first one is the body belongs to God. The second is that we are integrated wholes within ourselves, body, mind, emotions, will. All of that is integrated within us. And how we feel about ourselves affects how we think about ourselves and how we act. And conversely, how we act very much affects how we think about ourselves and feel about ourselves and what we wish to do. Right? So that's the second underlying principle. And the third is that medicine is a good thing. Here, and I'll make these sources a little bit bigger. Now you may, that's not obvious, right? As you can see in Exodus 15 here, God said, if you will heed the Lord your God diligently, doing what is upright in his sight, giving ear to his commandments and keeping all his laws, then it will not bring upon you any of the diseases that I brought upon the Egyptians, for I, the Lord, am your healer. And in other places of the Bible, God says that if you disobey the law, one of the punishments is that you will be ill. Now that raises real questions about the relationship between observing the commandments and illness, right? Let me just say, it's not a one-to-one connection. But what does come out of the Torah is that God inflicts illness and that God heals. So the Christians took from that, therefore, human beings should not engage in medicine because that's an act of human hubris, as it were. It's overweening pride on our part, and we're taking over something that's God's prerogative. And it's not until the 1500s, actually, that Christians begin to practice medicine. And through the Middle Ages, through antiquity and the Middle Ages, the physicians to Christian kings and queens and popes were either Jews or Muslims, right? Now, why so? Where do we get that from? Well, because these two sources are just two that I picked. But when men quarrel, this is the thing from Exodus 21 that I was talking about before in regard to abortion and the status of the fetus. When men quarrel and one strikes the other with stone or fist, and he does not die but has to take to his bed, that if he then gets up and walks outdoors on his staff, the assailant shall go unpunished, except that he must pay his idleness as time cured. He must surely cure him. That's the next. It's other lines in in chapter 21 that speak to the status of the fetus. This speaks to the fact that we have the right to try to heal people, v'rapo yirape, from which the rabbis deduce that medicine is permitted to us. And then, based on the next one, which is not quite as obvious, if you see your fellow's ox or sheep gone astray, do not ignore it. You must take it back to your fellow. If your fellow does not live near you, you do not know who he is. You shall bring it home, and it shall remain with you until your fellow claims it. Then you shall give it back to him. You shall return it. Now, this is returning a lost object, which doesn't seem to have anything to do with medicine. But there's an extra vav there. It could have said veheshivlo, and instead it says veheshivatolo. And so the rabbis deduced from this that if you have the obligation to return a lost person's property to that person, all the more you have a duty to return a person's lost health to that person. That is, engage in medicine, right? And who has the obligation to do that? Well, certainly those who are trained to do that. but also the entire community is responsible for providing health care for people who are not otherwise able to afford it. And that you get, let's see, did I give it to you? That you get in, among other things here, it is forbidden to live in a city in which there is no physician, which goes back to the first underlying principle that we were talking about. Because if you lived in a city in which there is no physician, then you could not get professional help to take care of this body of yours that belongs to God, right? So Jews have had a history of, I would say, basically a love affair with medicine. A lot of rabbis during the Middle Ages who were also physicians. Maimonides is probably the most famous among them, but there are a lot of them, right? It doesn't happen that much anymore because until very recently, to get training as a doctor was very short because there wasn't a lot that they could teach you. I actually was at a conference at the University of Virginia Medical School, and the dean of the medical school said, in Mr. Jefferson's medical school, how long do you think it took to become a doctor? Anyone want to guess? In the 18th century, what would you guess?
6 months?
Not quite that, 1 year, okay? But in the 1700s, they could not teach you anymore. Right now, of course, it's 4 years of pre-med and 4 years of medical school and a year internship and 3 years of residency and very often postdocs. So there are not a lot of people who go through, even though rabbinical school is more or less the same amount of time as it was in antiquity, medical school is much, much longer. So there are not a lot of MD rabbis. There are some, but not a lot. But there is this kind of love affair with medicine, and doctors and other medical personnel are very much honored in our tradition as being God's helpers in helping us maintain our health and cure when that's possible. So those are some of the fundamental underlying assumptions of the Jewish tradition vis-a-vis medicine. As I said in the book, Matters of Life and Death, I talk about 3 or 4 others, but this will be enough at least for our conversation next week and the week following. Next week, we're going to talk about some very contemporary issues having to do with the virus. And then the week after, we're going to talk about some end-of-life issues. But let me stop here and take, I don't have to run, so if you don't,
Rabbi
you don't
Dorff,
either.
why don't I ask you if you would take the sheet down there, the source sheet, and if I
Okay,
could ask
sure.
people who are interested in asking a question, if you could either physically or raise your hand on Zoom so we can call on you for that.
Let me see, how do I get out of, stop share, there we go.
Right.
There we are, good.
Okay.
And great. Anybody have questions, comments? Happy to talk.
Yes, Faye, go right ahead.
You mentioned in the last source, the permission and obligation to heal on 3 Deuteronomy. You said there was an extra vav and that therefore that the rabbis interpreted it differently. Could you expound on that? What was the communication?
The rabbis presume that that when God wrote the Torah, however you understand Revelation, when God wrote the Torah, God did not say anything superfluous. So that their interpretive assumption, the rabbi's interpretive assumption, is that if there's anything in the Torah that looks as if it's just repeating what could have been was said somewhere else, we're misunderstanding it. So that, for example, the commandment not to steal is written several different places in the Torah. So for the rabbis, that must mean that it's really referring to different kinds of theft. Right? So because God would never repeat God's help. Now, in the same sort of a way, here the Hebrew is v'hashevato lo. It could have been v'heshiv lo, and he returned it to him. That is, the finder needs to return the lost object to the owner, right? But it says v'hashevato lo, and return it to him, right? But you don't really need the it there because that comes from the earlier part of the sentence. So therefore they say, well, that must mean then that God intended that we learn something that we would not otherwise have learned from the simple command to return a lost object. And so that's what you're getting here. Now I must say that that interpretive assumption is rampant among the rabbis, and it's and it leads to some really interesting interpretations that you would never imagine, okay, that the Torah says, but that's part of a living tradition. Let me just say that the same sort of thing, well, at least, Justice Scalia, Aloha Shalom, wrote a book about his theory of American law, and Justice Breyer wrote a book about his theory of American law. They are radically different understandings of how the law operates, right? Justice Scalia is a legal positivist. That is, just look at the text and try to figure out what the original meaning was, right? Whereas Justice Breyer talks about a living covenant. That is, the law is there to be interpreted and applied to society as it changes over time, right? And by the way, you get the exact same disagreement in Jewish law as well, even within our own movement, right? I'm a Justice Breyer kind of person, and Rabbi Joel Roth is a kind of Justice Scalia kind of person. We're very good friends. He was actually my junior high, when I was 15 years old, he was my junior counselor at Camp Ramon, Wisconsin. So we've known each other for a very long time. We spent our lives, we're both conservative rabbis. We spent our lives teaching rabbinical students. I mean, the proverbial Martian would not see a lot of difference between us, right? But we do disagree on how we understand and apply Jewish law, even though we both take it very seriously, right? And this is one example of how the rabbis expanded the law beyond its original meaning to include something that was probably never intended.
Thank you. Barbara Cohen, you have a question? You have your hand up. Can you unmute yourself, Barbara?
Yeah, sorry.
Great, go right ahead.
Okay. I'm just curious if the patient talks about the afterlife, how do you respond to that question?
Oh dear, here we go. Well, I will. All right, let me just tell you a story, all right, because it happens to be a true story and it does respond to your question. For many years in Los Angeles, maybe 3 decades actually, there was a program on Sunday nights called Religion on the Line. And it actually in the 70s had the second largest radio audience of any program in Southern California. And it was 9 p.m. to midnight, a priest, a minister, and a rabbi, and sometimes somebody from another religious tradition that were answering questions that were asked, okay? So every once in a while, I was the rabbi. And one time that I was, somebody called up and said, what do you believe about life after death? So the moderator said, well, it was that I came from the oldest tradition, so I should go first. So I said, we really don't know what happens after death because nobody has come back to tell us, right? But the rabbis believed in life after death because in order to preserve God's justice, I mean, they were very much aware. They say in Brachot 7a, Tzadik v'ralo rashava tovlo, the righteous person suffers and the wicked person prospers. So how could that be if you have a just God? So one of the ways in which they try to deal with that is to say that there will be a life after death in which the accounts get rectified, in which the righteous get their just reward and the evil get their just punishment. Okay, so that they believe in a life after death primarily for that, and they even say that anybody who does not believe in a life after death and they go even further than that, and that the Torah itself says so, loses his place in the world to come. Right? They say that in the Mishnah and Sanhedrin. Okay, so they really believed in this, and they did it, I think, primarily for purposes of maintaining God's justice. And then once they believed in it, they let their imagination run wild, and in a life after death, what's going to happen is what their greatest fantasies are. First of all, you don't have to work for a living. We're all pescatarians. We all eat from the flesh of the Leviathan. And what do you do all day? You study Torah, except that you don't suffer with people like me. You have God as your teacher. Okay, so that's what's going to happen in life after death. And this even gets into the folklore, because if you remember in Fiddler on the Roof, for example, right? If he were a rich man, then after he gets the stairway that goes to nowhere and as many chickens as his wife wants and all of that, right? He gets to the ultimate prize. He will be able to ask a question that will cross a rabbi's eyes, right? So you're able, the ultimate life after death is studying Torah with God. But we really don't know because nobody has ever come back to tell us. And then the priest said, but we know, okay. And he then proceeded to tell us about Dante's Inferno and Dante's Paradiso, right? So when it comes time to talking about, and by the way, we have a lot of sociological evidence that if you talk about life after death, among Jews, a very small percentage of Jews believe in it. It's far less than a third, actually, of Jews believe in a life after death. So, I mean, I think, you know, what you're now asking is a pastoral question as opposed to a philosophical question. I think those are really very different levels of discussion, and you need to think about them very differently. You know, if, well, I mean, you know, I'll give you a case in point. There is a family in Los Angeles who, as it happens, both of them were former students of mine. And they had 3 children, and the youngest of whom was a toddler, and they were visiting another friend of theirs on Sukkot. And they, unbeknownst to them, the toddler walked off and ended up drowning in the swimming pool. Okay, so there must have been 1,000 people at that funeral because this is a couple that's very much involved in the Jewish community, and it was such a tragic loss, right? So I went also to the Shiva call, one of the Shiva calls, and the woman, who was again a former student of mine in philosophy, actually, I said, I have to talk to you. So we went off to some room, and she said she had Haredi relatives from Denver who had come and told her God only does this to people who can respond to it, people who can take it. She said to me, do you believe that? And I said, no. She said, thank God, right? Because it's driving me up a wall, right? So, I mean, I think you need to, helping people at a time of tragedy is a completely different skill than philosophy is. And I think both of them are really important. Not that one has nothing to do with the other, but I would not say to somebody something that I don't believe, first of all, right? And what I would want to talk about are the memories of the deceased, because what happens in, you know, the way that we separate from the deceased is that we separate physically through burial, but then psychologically, the way that we separate from the deceased is by going through a lot of the memories of the deceased. And I have, you know, I go to a house of mourning and I will say to the, you know, to one of the mourners, tell me the earliest memories you have of the deceased, because people tend to focus on the last days of the deceased and the way that the person died. But remembering the deceased is the entirety of the person's life. So often I will say, tell me your earliest memories of the deceased. And often it's 45 minutes before I get to question number 2. Because I've indicated that I'm willing to listen to the stories. And I am willing to listen to the stories because that's what mourning is all about, right? So if they tell me, do you think my deceased is living in a life after death? I would say, I honestly don't know. But that's not really what's important now. What's important now is to remember your loved one. So tell me your earliest memories. That's what I would do.
Rabbi Dorff, we have time for one more question.
Okay.
Paul Ramon.
Yeah, so what is the Jewish medical ethics view on accepting alternative medicine, like non-traditional, non-mainstream medicine, you know, opposed to traditional mainstream medicine?
I mean, the tradition is, well, the tradition is very committed to the truth. As a matter of fact, it says that God's, the seal of God is emet, you know, is truth. Now, how do we define truth in medicine, right? There are, I mean, there has developed over time scientific methods to try to test diseases. I mean, you know, the first stage, second stage, third stage of testing medications and testing procedures and all of that, right? And those are the ones that give us, I think, pretty firm knowledge. Now, that said, right, there have been folk remedies that have been around since antiquity, and some of them help. And some of them, there's Chinese medicine, which is very different from Western allopathic medicine. And for some people, for some diseases, it helps. I wouldn't, well, let me just say, I would go to an MD before I would go to somebody who does alternative medicine first, right? And if they can help me, I would follow their advice. And as we're going to see next week, I certainly do not want to believe what's on the internet about the vaccine and all of that, right? But it's a, I know people who have migraine headaches, and the medicine is not really very good yet about migraine headaches. And some people get some relief from acupuncture and things like that, or massages or things in that order, right? So on the one hand, it would not be my first choice if I had a problem, right? But on the other hand, and I would be a little bit wary about claims that are very much fly in the face of modern medicine, right? I would be very wary about those kinds of claims. But as an addition to something, to what you're trying, it depends upon what kind of risk you're taking, right? When you're doing these alternative medicine things, it depends upon also the extent to which the particular issue is strictly a physical issue, and the degree in which it involves your mind, your emotions, your will, right? I mean, a lot of that is, just to take one example, exercise, right, is a really important thing. And we now know very much why it's an important thing, aside from the fact that you'll be able to probably live longer, in terms of what it does to the serotonin levels in your mind and, and all of that, right? So that's not medicine per se, although doctors will tell you should exercise, right? So, I mean, I think it depends what you're talking about, for whom, and in what context. I'm afraid that has to be my answer. It's more complicated than you probably wanted. I'm sorry.
All right, I think we're going to stop right there. Before we wish people a good night, just first I wanted to thank Rabbi Dorff for his talk tonight. We're looking forward to the next 2 weeks. Hope everyone will join us again. We will post this recording and I'll send it out through a Zoom reminder to the group, but it'll be on YouTube sometime in the next couple of days, probably before Shabbat. And I will look forward to seeing you next week. Since we have a lot of people who are not from the congregation, I'm going to put up as a final screen some information about the synagogue. If anyone needs contact information, wants to reach us, hear about the synagogue, we'll do that as well. But thank you very much, Rabbi Dorff. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. Have a good night and Shabbat Shalom.
Exactly
Thank
right.
you.
Shabbat shalom.
Amen. Thank you. Good night.
Good to see everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, Mom. Hi, Nancy and Manny.
Oh,
Good to
Manny's
see you.
coming back. Manny heard his name.
Hi.